Civics 101 is brought to you by Progressive, one of the country's leading providers of auto insurance. With Progressive's Name Your Price tool, you say what kind of coverage you're looking for and how much you want to pay. And Progressive will help you find options that fit within your budget. Use the Name Your Price tool and start an online quote today at progressive.com. Price and coverage match, limited by state law.
Civics 101 is supported in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. You're listening to Civics 101. I'm Hannah McCarthy.
I'm Nick Capodice.
This show is often about understanding a law or a political event or process, something written down and codified. But the truth is, a lot of the time in the U.S., we do things because that's just the way we do them. That's the norm.
So these are things that aren't formal laws, but we still expect people to abide by? Like there's no law that says you must not cut in line at the grocery store, but you just don't do it.
Exactly, because if you did, you'd be a jerk. You'd also be setting a bad precedent. You'd be teaching people the wrong lesson. The way I think of it is if everybody started cutting in line at the grocery store, the simple act of paying for your food would dissolve into chaos. And the same goes for democratic norms.
It's a non-written down rule that is usually often kind of taken for granted and not even noticed as a rule until it's violated.
This is Susan Stokes. She's a professor of politics at the University of Chicago and director of the Chicago Center on Democracy.
So, to give an example, it sort of goes without saying in general that that the outgoing president will attend the inauguration of the incoming president. And I'm not sure we would have even thought of that as a norm. We wouldn't have thought hard about why that is helpful or why it is anything more than just like showing up at an event until it, now it's about to be violated or not to be followed.
So these aren't written, but they're customs and traditions. Like it is customary to address other members of Congress with ridiculously flowery language, to not insult a U.S. ally. It's customary for a president to release their tax returns. And it's customary for elected officials to eventually accept the results of an election.
What does that do for us? Well, it's part of a kind of peaceful transition of power that is part of the very definition of democracy. So it turns out to be incredibly important.
Norms like fancy congressional language during debate, that keeps people polite and respectful and lets procedure flow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentlelady for yielding and congratulate her on her extraordinary leadership.
It's basically a step above common courtesy and not punching below the belt. But not all democratic norms are like that.
A lot of these norms actually do help keep our system going. They do help us have a system in which you kind of channel what might be violent conflict into peaceable, mechanisms for adjudicating differences. So, democracy is not about everybody agreeing. It's about shifting from a potentially violent arena to a peaceable arena.
So democratic norms help us maintain courtesy, keep things on schedule, and keep the peace. Basically, these are all the little traditions that stitch a functioning democracy together. But I do see a glaring problem here, Hannah. We rely on a lot of these norms, but they aren't laws. It is perfectly legal to ignore them.
To put proper names on it, it's bad for Democrats and it's bad for Republicans. It's bad for anyone who is invested in a kind of ongoing system in which they can compete for power without risking violence and achieve power if they have good ideas and are able to get people to vote for them. So I do think that there should be a very strong bipartisan support for strengthening these norms.
Are democratic norms ever made into law?
Well, I think we're learning, getting a kind of crash course right now in the 14th Amendment and, post-Civil War rules that were written into the Constitution that were sort of meant to deal with the aftermath and create incentives to avoid another sort of, violent, breaking apart of the country and leaders acting in a kind of treasonous manner.
In other words, what might have been considered a democratic norm before the Civil War, in this case office holders engaging in sedition or rebellion, became a constitutional law after that norm was violated, which could potentially happen again. if not through a constitutional amendment, then maybe in U.S. code. Especially if norms are violated in frightening ways.
Like a rebellion.
Yeah, like that. In the meantime, these democratic norms that stitch the fabric of our government and politics together should probably still be followed. There's nothing else keeping them alive.
What you don't want is a period of our history in which norms are challenged and shattered, and you have a whole generation of young people thinking, well, those really aren't norms, and therefore, if some leaders don't follow them, they can't be very important, we should cast them aside. It's naive to think that those norms are anything real.
That does it for Democratic Norms on Civics 101. You can listen to all of our episodes at civics101podcast.org or wherever you get your podcasts.